Greetings, my scattered sisters and brothers in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that his presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. We are continuing on in 1 Peter chapter 3, still working with Peter's words to the Christian wives, and especially those who have unbelieving husbands. So chapter 3, verse 1, wives, in the same way submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles, braided hair, and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Now, there is a lot to untangle here. Braided hair, elaborate hair, a lot to untangle here. I want us to start at the end of the passage, not giving way to fear. And the word for fear here is not the normal word for fear in terms of the fear of the Lord or showing respect or honor. The word for fear here is about intimidation, not giving way to intimidation. And you kind of might be thinking, okay, where is this intimidation coming from? What are they actually fearing? Well, I suspect that the intimidation is, or the fear is kind of coming from competition in a sense. And so the fear of kind of losing their husbands, being intimidated by maybe other women and their beauty and their attractiveness and the way they adorn themselves. And so this fear of not being attractive enough, this fear of not measuring up to other women, and so that I might lose my husband because I'm not outwardly impressive enough or beautiful enough. And if we go back into first century Roman Empire, what we discover is that there is kind of a movement going on at this time, especially among the elite, but then that trickles down to everyone else across the empire. And in the Greco-Roman world, a man might have his wife, and then it was acceptable to have a mistress as well, or mistresses. And so that you would have your wife to bring some stability to the home, and then you could have your mistress for whatever your sexual appetites were. And this was kind of acceptable across the Roman Empire, and especially in the elite circles where the men could afford, quote unquote, more women. Well, this was a situation of intimidation, and where wives felt like they had to compete with prostitutes for the affection and the attention and the love of their husbands. And so you could see how this could trickle down to where the wife feels like she has to compete with kind of a quote unquote professional prostitute for the sexual attractiveness, the attention, the praise of her husband. And then what also began to happen during the first century is those women who had status and who had wealth and didn't actually have to depend upon their husbands, they began to compete for men. And so kind of like, well, if it's fair for the husband to have mistresses, I ought to be able to have as many men as I want. And so you had that going on, and to where women of status would, kind of play the field, if you were, while being married. They weren't going to let their husband stop them from playing the field. And so you had all of this kind of going on. And in the midst of this, what Peter is saying is, wives, imitate Christ and follow after Christ. And do your husbands right, no matter how they might be doing you or mistreating you, but you're going to imitate Christ. And then what I find especially interesting here is this idea of your hope is in God, That's how the women of the past, the noble women of the past, put their hope. Their hope was in God, not their husbands. And they are to have this inner beauty of a gentle spirit, of a tender heart, of kind of a quiet confidence, because their trust is in God, their hope is in God, and God highly values that inner person. God finds incredibly valuable that spirit of trusting in God, hoping in God, that spirit of kind of this quiet confidence in God. And so your value comes from God rather than your value coming from your husband, rather than your value coming from somehow competing against these other women. And you're not going to give in to that intimidation. You're not going to be intimidated into competing, intimidated into trying to be more beautiful than the other women around you, that your confidence is in God and your value comes from God. And so you're not going to give in to the intimidation of trying to compete. And over the long run, your inner beauty is going to surpass all outer beauty. And trusting God will open the eyes of your husband to recognize that and to see that. And I think about this, and I know that there's not space or time to really unpack everything in the passage, but to not be intimidated into competing when it comes to outward beauty, outward adornment, outward clothing, whatever, but that your beauty comes from within. And trust and hope is in God, not your husband, and to realize that God values the inner beauty, and trusting that the Lord will open the eyes of your husband to where that is what is valued. And I think that this is a word for more than just wives. I think across the board in our culture today, we find ourselves intimidated by outward appearance, intimidated by outward status. And so we can fall into this trap of always trying to impress, whether it's somebody in the opposite gender, whether it's somebody at work, but to fall into this fear of not being impressive enough. And so always striving to impress somebody else, always striving to impress in order to be accepted. Well, that's not really living with our identity in God and our recognition that God values kind of our inner self. And especially when we place our trust, our confidence in God. So wherever you find yourself scattered today, question, are you living intimidated? Are you living in the fear of not being impressive enough in some arena? And the challenge for us is, the call for us is to place our hope in God, not for those who are in that arena or not within those who are in that arena. And to have a gentle, quiet, confident spirit, trusting in Christ, knowing that Christ knows our heart, knowing that Christ values us, and that gives us the ability to live boldly against the intimidation because of our trust in Christ and knowing that our value comes from Christ. Well, wish there was more time to further explore this, but I challenge you to kind of contemplate it a little bit more. And again, that question, am I living in intimidation to where I'm just feeling like I'm not impressive enough? If that's you, put the brakes on. Put your trust, your hope in God, and realize that God values your inner self. As you place your trust and your hope in Him, you're able to live with a confidence in the face of those threats that you're not impressive enough. Well, God bless. Have a great day. And may the Lord help us all to live with this confidence in Him over against the threats that we're not impressive enough.